My name is Robin Newman, and I have a company known as the Huntington Relationship Center, and I am an Imago therapist.
And my name is David Weber, and I too have my own practice, the Holistic Counseling Center of Long Island, and I too am an Imago relationship therapist. I've had the pleasure and the privilege of collaborating with Robin over the years, and we're going to talk about some ideas and things that show up in our day-to-day practice and how they impact couples.
So one thing that David and I were discussing was the fact that people think that because we are relational therapists, that precludes an individual from coming in and getting everything that they need in a session. So I've gone down that rabbit hole with people, trying to explain to them that Imago is object relations oriented, attachment oriented, where everything goes back to childhood, and
psychodynamic theory as well. So the things that we experience in childhood show up in our intimate partner relationships as adults.
yes, it's also solution focused and gestalt. So all of these components together are extremely beneficial in trauma work.
Sure.
So I was sharing with David before we started to do this clip about an individual that came to see me that was a referral from another therapist. And I always appreciate referrals from therapists because that shows me that I'm doing my job out there.
Sure.
Those are always the best referrals. And she chose to not go with me because she said I was a romantic therapist and she wanted to be, and if she were to go into a romantic relationship, then she would choose me to be the therapist. And when a situation like that occurs, I don't know about you, but I don't even bother to push back because I think in every session I explain myself very clearly about what the basis is for Imago.
Right.
So have you also experienced something like this occasionally?
To some extent, yes. I think that, one of the things that I spend a little bit of time on, and I'm sure you do as well, is some of the things that we've talked about. Letting people know that a lot of the way they show up in intimate partner relationships today are based on the archetypes of both how to be a male or female and what to expect from a male or female by observing their primary caregivers.
Correct.
And so, working with what I would term, or the modern term of, little t traumas, whether it be neglect or that kind of thing from parents, or functionally absent fathers, for example, for young women. I find that, when I start to delve in that way rather than focus on, because I think that people don't really understand what Imago is, the scope and the breadth of what it can actually do.
I absolutely agree.
And so we actually, so I do use it on an individual level too. And, with the caveat that ultimately, you can't work on how you show up in relationships as a single person, for example. The only way to do that is be in a relationship. So you're only going to get so far working on your own. However, if you do a lot of that foundational work, it makes communication and growing deeper emotional intimacy much more likely in any relationship as you move out of the honeymoon phase.
I agree with that. Also, what's interesting is everything is relationship.
True.
Because what we do tend to do is we tend to replicate our family history in our places of work, in our friendships with people, obviously in our families, because that's where it stems from. And I find that at least with being a relational therapist, an Imago relational therapist, that it's so helpful for an individual. Because there are times when they don't recognize that they are replicating their parental units, their siblings, their whole role in their job, and they're miserable in their job.
Right.
And when you start to delve deeper into that, to look at the archetypes of the background of everything that's happening, they're blown away.
Sure.
And I always say that, have a relationship with yourself, understand yourself, how you call into patterns, how you I think of rolling down a hill and collecting moss as you're rolling down the hill.
Right.
It just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. but to really gear into that kind of stuff.
Oh, sure.
You
And I think
know?
that oftentimes, with some of the defenses that people create in childhood, for example, in order to deal with perhaps an overbearing parent, or, what Freud might have called the devouring mother, for example.
Oh gosh, yeah. Gosh, I remember that.
Some of those things, I think that people, they have that tendency to replicate those defenses in their relationships. So, for example, that can show up, especially when you do have a devouring mother, for example. It may show up in the sense of, immediate defensiveness and, slipperiness when it comes to conflict.
Yeah.
Not really willing to accept or responsibility or take accountability for one's own behavior.
Yeah.
Because it's easier to point a finger at someone else rather than it is to say, okay, I'm contributing to my partner in the way they're showing up here today with me.
Right. My favorite AA saying, and I always say that I love working with people in recovery because AA has the best metaphors. When you point a finger at someone else, there's three pointing back at yourself.
Definitely.
My grandmother, I taught her that phrase and she loved it. She used to use it all the time.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's very, very true.
Sure. I use it often in my practice as well,
Yeah.
especially because some of my background in recovery and, through the trauma-informed recovery
Yeah.
and the work that I've done.
Yeah, yeah.
So
it's interesting because, it's funny. I was just telling somebody today that I also think what's great about Imago is, and this person has had a lot of exposure to Imago therapy, is to listen to your gut. Because usually your gut is right.
Sure.
We go into override.
Right.
Because if something's familiar, we immediately fall into the pattern of saying, oh, this is my soulmate. They finish my sentences.
Yes.
But sometimes that's not real.
Right.
Most of the time that's not real.
Right.
And if you do have a feeling about something as a single person,
sure.
then don't proceed.
Right.
Investigate it in therapy and then go cautiously.
Sure. I think that, there's an interesting book that's out and it kind of describes things about love and the concept of limerence as well. That feeling of being loved. What is that all about? And there's some interesting research just starting to demonstrate that the whole butterflies things that everybody seeks in a relationship is actually a trauma warning that something's not quite right.
It's cortisol.
Right.
Yes, it's cortisol.
Right.
That's what people don't understand is, I have flutters in my stomach.
Right.
You're making those flutters.
Right.
And it's funny because when we do the workshop, which we will plug at some point, when we do the workshop, that's one of the first things we say is that those flutters that you're feeling in your stomach or, the sweaty
Yes.
palms, the chest stuff, that's all created by you.
Right.
Not created by the partner person, but that is trauma.
Right. And that's an early warning that something's
Yes,
not quite
it is.
right.
Do you ever think of Will Robinson?
Yes.
Boston Space Danger,
the
Will
robot.
Robinson.
Yeah. We're showing our age.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yes, and I think it's I think it was since nobody's really taught what it is that they should be looking for in relationships because there's no concept of that in our education system, and so it's the person that brings you peace. That when you're if you're cuddling with them or you're laying with them and you actually feel peaceful for the first time in your life, or even maybe more than once, but I mean, you do have that sense of peace. That's the person. They may not feel as exciting right off the bat.
That's exactly what I was talking to this person about today.
Mm-hmm.
Don't look for the excitement.
Right. It's actually going to feel a little boring.
It is.
Right.
That's exactly what we connected with on today. And it's funny because I was explaining to them that when I first met this husband 22 years ago, I was curious. There were things I looked at, but there wasn't rockets. There weren't fireworks, and it took 8 months to get to a place of where there was just a real feeling of safety, just knowing that. And I think we're also conditioned to go for the rockets,
right?
And for the all of the intense feelings and the sex and all of that because of society and what's inflicted on us. And I say inflicted because we take it,
sure,
and then we run with it.
We want someone to take our breath away,
Exactly, right? Exactly.
And that's not necessarily a healthy thing.
No, it is not.
There are ways to go about that can actually work.
Yeah.
But that in the very beginning, I think that's the most unhealthy sort of indicator.
Yeah.
Using the opposite, using that that feeling of taking my breath away and saying, "Man, well, that might feel good now, but
it ain't gonna feel good later."
Especially when you get into the power struggle portion
yes.
of Imago, and that's after the honeymoon phase.
Yes.
So it's that not so much power struggle for dominance as I understood it, right? And I'm sure you see it the same way.
Yes.
But it's more the power struggle is the power to be heard and understood.
Absolutely.
And that feeling won't help you because actually it'll be gone in about 2 years.
Yes, it will.
So if you're looking for a monogamous long-term relationship.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, totally agree with that.
And so at that point too is what we see with couples frequently is, attempting to bend the truth a little bit in an attempt to get along.
Yeah.
And so, it often shows up in my relationship counseling and with my individuals where I often have to counsel that thoughts, words, and deeds have to align.
Absolutely.
And, when words and deeds don't, people can detect that. And so, that shows up in a form of defensiveness. It shows up in a form of almost like wriggling like a snake or a worm type of stuff. And people will smell that.
They do.
And then what it does is begin to erode trust.
Yes, it does. And then the trust creates conflict.
Correct.
And then that, a lot of times people don't want to work through the conflict.
Right.
But if we look right up there, in conflict there is growth. That is my favorite
Sure.
Imagoism.
Sure.
Which is so true because most people, when that happens, they then end up fleeing.
Right.
Or, if they're more reptilian and not monkeys, they'll end up fleeing,
Sure.
because it's the fight or flight syndrome. So,
right.
But that's a really good point. It's very true. It really is. I see that often, and I try to explain to people that actions, words have to align. I had a session, oh my goodness, Thursday night, where the gentleman was over a half an hour late for our session. And I really, and his wife sat here before for the half hour looking at me saying, this is exactly the stuff where he tells me how deeply he loves me, but this is what he does all the time. So how am I supposed to believe that there is actual desire to be connected to me or to be interested in what I'm saying?
And he probably doesn't have the insight into understanding that, there's the implicit message he's sending by being late.
Correct.
That this is not as important. Other things are.
Correct.
There's a saying that I often use and I counsel with people too is, if you're interested, you'll do what's convenient. But if you're dedicated, you'll do what it takes.
Yeah.
Oftentimes in our society today, the concept of, hey, when you ask somebody how they are, which has become like part of our greeting in American society in my lifetime, they'll say, oh, busy, but good. Well, it's almost as if exhaustion is a badge of honor in American society today. And they're spending way too much time working, doing other things, and wondering what's on their phones, and not enough time connecting.
Big issue.
And that has changed drastically in our lifetime.
Well, it has, and it makes me sad because I know that before COVID, it just feels like it's crescendoing in such a way that is not a positive. And I always say to people, stop being a human doing and be a human being.
Right.
Because human being, be human. It's like kind of like, and I'm not the one that coined that, somebody else did.
Yeah, that was from the 60s, wasn't it? The human being, I think that was
at
some point, right?
I
want to say like Berkeley or something.
Something. But it's true though.
Right.
But it's so true because I think that is such a big issue with so many people that come in.
Sure.
It's just, it's too much.
And they downplay, so they may have insight. They may do the first two parts of validating and empathizing with a partner as they grow and learn to do this.
Yeah.
But it's that last final step that they have the biggest trouble with, and that's connecting with the other person's emotions.
Yes.
So they may say something like, you make sense to me because I imagine you're feeling X.
Yes.
But then instead of actually coming from that place, they will say, however, you're wrong because this is what I really mean.
Yes.
And that solves nothing.
Well, that also undoes the validation.
Correct.
It's
immediately.
Like, it's the same thing as saying, I'm so sorry you feel that way.
Right.
Drop the mic. It's like, drop the mic.
Right.
But it's a similar thing. And I think that for me, and I don't know how you feel about this, but the most difficult part of keeping people connected in the intentional dialogue is explaining, first of all, what intentionality really is.
Right.
And I always say to them, I'm very much like, state highway patrolman standing over you. You have to do the speed limit in the beginning. There's freedom in form over time, but you have to learn how to be intentionally connected and listening. It's active listening. There's a difference between hearing and listening.
Right.
But once people master that, I see a lot of struggling with the validation piece, because they'll do great, and then all of a sudden they'll come in with that point, but and it's that defensive posture.
But what about what you're doing to me?
Right. It's always like reverse. I'm like, and I just look at them and I'll just go, guys, you just undid the whole validation.
Right.
But I don't understand how I did that.
Right.
And then you have to explain to them. But I also think, and I don't know, I was just saying this to someone today, I have noticed that my practice is ratcheted up to such a high frequency. The cases that are coming in, first of all, I believe environment affects
Absolutely.
everybody. So all of the crazy that's going on in this world right now, and it is crazy, is affecting people in their relationships.
Sure.
So that's coming in with, on top of the stuff that they already have.
Right.
And ever since everybody went remote with their jobs, the demand is insane.
Sure.
You can't work 80 hours a week and think you're going to have a relationship with someone.
And that's the big thing too, is because, since second wave feminism, and yes, women should have had the option to be able to work and earn a living if they chose to.
Right.
But nobody really thought about what it would look like to the nuclear family.
Mm-mm.
What were the duties and responsibilities going to be? So there were assumptions made that they would do both, work and maintain their house and raise the children.
Which is really blowing up.
It's not working anymore.
No, it really isn't.
And
I see that as well.
especially in the Northeast, these higher, the higher earnings areas like New York, California, we're seeing on the West Coast as well, where people are burning out. And they're wondering why they're unable to connect with their spouse, and why there's this almost a formation of boredom in the relationship. Well, if you don't spend time,
it's going to be boring.
Of course. And all you're doing is working to, and the only conversations you have so here's operant conditioning playing out too. The only phone conversations they're having are discussing what problems exist in the family.
Right, exactly.
And they're not having conversations like they used to when they first met, whether it be flirtatious in some way, or, hey, let's make a plan, or, what was the good part of your day?
Or even sexy texting with your partner.
Absolutely.
I mean, I tell people all the time, send a sexy text.
Yes.
It's just something that will...
You did it in the beginning.
Right, but that also comes down to, think about it, appreciations.
Sure.
Because that is a way of appreciating your partner for who they are. Also, just people need to feel like they matter.
Right.
Like we do Don does a whole segment. He's he's a facilitator, but I'm telling these folks out here that he is an Imago facilitator, so he helps me with the workshops, and we're very excited that you're going to be doing the workshops with us.
Sure.
But it boggles the mind that people they don't even consciously thank their partner for doing something, because everybody's so rushed in their life, and there's just assumptions, and there's a little bit of a loss of gratitude. Assumptions, yes, I agree.
That someone should do something because of perhaps a gender role, or traditional or otherwise.
I agree.
And there's no appreciation for these things, and it's all about now, especially younger generations.
Yeah.
An expectation something should be fixed in the house immediately. Meanwhile, that person is working long hours. Whether it be male or female, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Where this problem should be taken care of, where that financial need needs to be resolved immediately.
Yeah.
But we didn't get here overnight. We're not going to get out of it overnight. And there's no clasping of hands and saying, let's do this together. And there's a forgetting of power in numbers.